the Democratic measure by a vote of 21 to 79. They're voting now on the Republican measure, and you can follow the Senate debate and vote on C-SPAN 2. And on C-SPAN 3, a hearing continues on the oversight of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, live on C-SPAN 3, and now live to the House floor, here on C-SPAN.
The House will be in order. Prayer will be offered by our chaplain, Father Conroy.
Let us pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks for giving us another day. You have blessed us with all good gifts, and with thankful hearts we express our gratitude. You have created us with opportunities to serve other people in their need, to share together in respect and affection, and to be faithful in the responsibilities we have been given. We wish to acknowledge before you, O God, the sacrifice of so many American men and women and many allies during many years of our commitments in Iraq. We thank them and you for their service and ask your continued blessing upon them as they now live into a future more secure because of their efforts. In this moment of prayer, please grant to the members of this people's house the gifts of wisdom and discernment, that in their words and actions they will do justice, love with mercy, and walk humbly with you. May all that is done this day be for your greater honor and glory. Amen.
The Chair has examined the journal of the last day's proceedings and announces to the House his approval thereof. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1, the journal stands approved. The Pledge of Allegiance today will be led by the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Graves.
Pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The Chair will entertain up to 15 one-minute requests on each side. For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina rise? Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the President announced he will veto the payroll tax extension bill passed by House Republicans due to the inclusion of the Keystone pipeline construction. The President campaigns for jobs, but will sadly veto a jobs bill. This fall, I was fortunate to visit Alberta, Canada, and witness firsthand the environmental safeguards to develop Canadian oil sands. The construction of this environmentally advanced pipeline will create at least 120,000 new American jobs without costing taxpayers a dime and will stimulate our economy. Walter C. Jones in the Augusta Chronicle reported that refined oil products with no pipeline will be denied to South Carolinians at a North Augusta terminal. With a record unemployment rate of over 8% for 34 months and over 13 million Americans looking for jobs, it is very sad the President would veto legislation creating jobs. In conclusion, God bless our troops, and we will never forget September 11th and the global war on terrorism.
Gentleman's time's expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York rise? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, as a member of the Committee on Homeland Security, I rise to express my concern about the direction of the Urban Area Security Initiative program. UASI was created to develop capabilities to prevent and to respond to attacks and catastrophes in our most vulnerable cities. The program has helped develop joint initiatives among local governments in my community of Buffalo, Niagara. We have an obligation to protect this investment and the capability gains developed across the country. Yet recent drastic cuts in the UASI funding have resulted in the elimination of 32 of the 64 urban areas from the program. That puts the preparedness and security capability gains we've achieved at risk. In order to raise awareness of this problem, this week I formed the Preserving Yawasi Capability Gains Caucus with Congressman Steve Stivers of Columbus, Ohio. I also introduced legislation to preserve the capability gains achieved by communities like Buffalo that were dropped from the Yawasi program. I urge my colleagues who represent Yawasi communities to join our caucus so that we can protect our capability gains and ensure our communities are properly secured. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Request permission to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, some Americans worry about big labor, others worry about big business. But what really scares most Americans is the massive federal government snooping around, meddling, and controlling every aspect of people's lives. According to a Gallup poll released this week, the overwhelming majority, 64%, of those surveyed think that big government will be the biggest threat to the country in the future. It's worth noting about half of those people who participated were Democrats that agreed that big government is the problem. No surprise. When I meet with my neighbors in Southeast Texas, their message for the federal government is clear. Back off. Stop saddling expensive, job-killing, and unnecessary regulations on businesses. The mere phrase, "I'm from the federal government and I'm here to help you," brings fear and trepidation into the hearts and souls of small business owners and individuals throughout the fruited plain. After all, the Constitution says we, the people, are to control government, not the other way around. Government should not run roughshod over our personal liberty, and that's just the way it is.
Gentleman's time's expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Request permission to address the House for 1 minute, Mr. Speaker, and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, during this season of giving, when our nation should be reflecting on the needs of our friends and neighbors who are out of work, struggling to provide for their loved ones, this chamber yesterday voted to cut unemployment benefits for 1 million of our fellow Americans. The House Majority's bill would eliminate several tiers of benefits created under the Emergency Unemployment Compensation Program, which has provided up to 99 weeks of support for those who lost their jobs through no fault of their own. If this legislation becomes law, the maximum potential unemployment benefit will fall by 40 weeks. This legislation would also allow states, many of which are struggling to balance their budgets, to reduce the average weekly amount available to beneficiaries. With over 8% unemployment, I'm strongly opposed to any reduction in emergency unemployment insurance. I'm a proud supporter, though, of moving the XL pipeline project forward and supported it in separate legislation. The XL pipeline makes both energy and economic sense for our country, and I hope the administration will find a way to allow the construction to commence in some states while still revisiting the route in Nebraska. I urge my colleagues to stand to support over 13 million Americans looking for work this holiday season and pass a clean extension of unemployment.
Gentleman's time's expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia rise? Without objection, gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to give thanks today to my House colleagues who yesterday, in bipartisan fashion, moved to start construction on the Keystone XL pipeline, because this is truly a shovel-ready project that will provide good jobs and secure energy for Americans. The Keystone pipeline will create nearly 100,000 private sector jobs once completed. 20,000 of those jobs generated just to construct the pipeline, with 50 companies in Georgia benefiting from this. And once it's finished, this pipeline will pump 700,000 gallons of crude oil a day from our friend and neighbor, Canada. A good, reliable, and secure supply of oil. The environmental impact statements have been completed. The path for the pipeline has been determined. The only thing standing in the way is politics. President Obama has postponed his decision on whether the private sector can build this pipeline until after the next election. If it's good enough after the election, surely it's good enough today. Good jobs, secure energy, no cost to the taxpayers. It's a no-brainer.
Gentleman's time's expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey rise? Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the majority unwisely gambled with the economic security of the middle class. They voted on legislation that was designed to fail, fully knowing that it will be dead on arrival in the Senate and vetoed by the President. By tying the extension of the payroll tax to controversial and unrelated policies, the majority is playing a dangerous game that could hurt dangerous game that could result in tax hikes for 160 million workers. Moreover, attaching the Medicare duck fix to the same divisive policy they have endangered seniors' access to doctors. We must support a clean extension of the payroll tax holiday and the unemployment insurance that is not paid for through increased health care costs for seniors or at the expense of public health. If we fail to pass a clean extension of the payroll tax holiday or unemployed benefits, the average American family will lose a tax break worth $1,000, and our economy will lose $30 billion as the unemployed will lose much-needed assistance. Now is not the time to play risky games with our economy. We must pass a clean extension of the payroll tax and continue assistance for the unemployed. And I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia rise? Without objection, the gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, as my colleague from West Georgia, Congressman Graves, just said, the House took action yesterday to boost our economy and create jobs. And I stand before you now to employ Senate Democrats and President Obama follow suit and to support the Keystone Pipeline project. The pipeline, which has been delayed for more than 3 years by this administration, would be a critical step towards energy independence and job creation in the United States. This pipeline would transport 1.4 million barrels of oil per day from Canada down to the Gulf Coast refineries, drastically reducing our reliance on Middle East imports and create, yes, more than 100,000 jobs nationwide. This does include Georgia, where Keystone fuel will be shipped by existing pipelines to terminals in Atlanta, Rome, Augusta, Athens, as well as to other East Coast customers. The time to act is now, Mr. Speaker. I urge my colleagues in the Senate and President Obama to allow production to begin. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Connecticut rise?
To address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, gentleman from Connecticut is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to honor an extraordinary American, fishing captain James Henry from the town of Mystic, Connecticut. Captain Henry has just published his first book in a fisherman's language at the age of 98. What's even more extraordinary is that Captain Henry was illiterate until the age of 91. But after learning the inspiring story of George Dawson, the grandson of a slave who taught himself to read and write at the age of 98, Captain Henry began his journey to literacy. A retired East Lyme English teacher and literacy volunteer from Eastern Connecticut, Mark Hogan, tutored Captain Henry along his journey and helped him edit his book. In a fisherman's language, artfully weaves together the life of this lobsterman, sharing his stories from his life on his grandfather's farm in Portugal, his work on the boats, a member of the Connecticut National Guard, a professional boxer, and a shipfitter at Electric Boat Shipyard. What initially started as a small project has gained international attention. Selling the original 750 copies in just 2 weeks, he's been contacted by film producers, TV stations, and audiobook companies alike who want to share his story with the world. It has been quite a long journey from being unable to read and write and being a source of inspiration to young writers and a beacon of hope for those struggling with their own literacy. I urge my colleagues to read this amazing book and salute Captain Henry for his amazing accomplishment. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania rise? 1 minute. Without objection, gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, throughout this year, House Republicans have been fighting for job creation, working to prevent the federal government from damaging our economy and job growth. The present administration has tried to downplay the effect new regulations will have on companies struggling in the weak economy. Today's Wall Street Journal documents efforts of the White House Office on Information and Regulatory Affairs to muddy the waters about regulations. The official Obama administration compilation of regulations ignores significant institutions such as the National Labor Relations Board and the Securities and Exchange Commission. Yet the number of economically significant rules at all stages has risen to 149, a historic high. Vast sections of industry are waiting to hear how the federal government will change the way they have to do business. How on earth can we expect them to hire new workers when they can't plan with this regulatory uncertainty? The administration can try to manipulate the numbers, but there can be no doubt that the federal regulatory juggernaut is holding back job growth. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon rise? Without objection, gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 1 minute.
Well, folks, your Congress is at it again. Republicans have been talking about debt and deficit for the last year, and here we're going to add nearly $200 billion in new spending to the deficit. And we're going to use a bunch of pay-fors that we're setting aside for the original deficit. This is the most disingenuous group of folks that I've seen in a long time. And to be honest, a little bit on our side of the aisle, we've been railing about doing anything that would remotely affect Social Security, and yet we're willing to pass another payroll tax cut that adds to the difficulty of funding our system. We're going to issue some IOUs. I don't think there's a single American out there that believes in another IOU is a good thing for Social Security. We have got to stop borrowing against our Social Security. Not only that, the payroll tax, you get only 60 cents back for every dollar you invest. I don't think that's a very good investment. President Bush tried that in 2008, and there was no change in consumption. What we should be doing is focusing on unemployment, where you get $1.60 back in economic activity for every dollar you put in, just like the President asked for. And we should have a more robust doc fix that makes sure seniors and doctors get paid what they need to keep Medicare solvent. And I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Tennessee rise? Without objection, gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 1 minute.
Last night, the House passed Jobs Bill number 28 that is now awaiting action from President Obama and the Democratic-controlled Senate. The Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act will protect American workers from higher taxes while ensuring that resources are not taken from the Social Security Trust Fund to pay for this relief. Most importantly, this legislation includes a measure that will support the creation of more than 100,000 new American jobs by expediting the creation of the Keystone XL energy pipeline. This Christmas season, Congress and the President have the opportunity to give the American people the gift of jobs and tax relief that they need without spending more money that we do not have. It is time for President Obama to live up to his own rhetoric of "we can't wait" and put partisan politics aside and get Americans back to work. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland rise? Without objection, gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I am saddened to report that the ancient Christian heritage in Turkey is being threatened with extinction. When a government compromises the rights of its citizens to peaceably assemble, the right of expression, and the right of independent thought, the people of such a country are not fully free. When a government takes the property of citizens without just compensation and due process of law, the people of that country are not free. And when a government discriminates against citizens on account of their religion and ethnic origins, again, freedom is denied. While Turkey has taken some positive steps in recent times, freedom is not a matter of half measures. Our NATO ally must unequivocally and zealously defend the individual liberties of all its citizens. I support passage of House Resolution 306 to urge the Republic of Turkey to safeguard its Christian heritage and to return confiscated church properties. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan rise?
I rise to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to implore my colleagues in the Senate and to the President, it's time to stand with the American worker. We're talking about adding 20,000 jobs as we approve the Keystone pipeline coming from Alberta, Canada, down to the Gulf Shore. But Canada is already a leading source of our oil. They actually give us more oil and produce more oil than Saudi Arabia. Michigan is actually an excellent example about what happens when that partnership. Enbridge, which is actually a competitor to TransCanada right now, is already looking at increasing its capacity and expanding its pipeline. Marathon Refinery is looking at expanding its capacity to be able to handle these Canadian crudes. We know that this inflow of Canadian oil is a positive thing. Zero taxpayer dollars are going to be used for this, and it will put thousands of our American workers back to work at a crucial time. The oil will be extracted. The question is, where is it going to go? Is it going to be shipped to the United States and create U.S. jobs, or is it going to go to Asia to help fund the engine to compete against us? Time to stand with the American worker, Mr. President. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the minority leader rise?
Ask the United unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the minority leader is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as we gather here, President Obama is at Fort Bragg honoring and thanking our men and women in uniform for their service and the war in Iraq and for the sacrifices they have been willing to make to keep us the home of the brave and the land of the free. America's brave men and women in uniform have done everything that has been asked of them. They have performed with valor, with courage, with patriotism, and a dedication to duty. It is because of our troops and the leadership of President Obama that this month we were able to say the war in Iraq is over. Our troops are coming home for the holidays with our families. And as we thank our troops, we also thank the families of our men and women in uniform for the sacrifices they have been willing to make for our country. President Obama promised to end the war in Iraq responsibly. Promise made, promise kept. When he took office, nearly 150,000 American troops were deployed in Iraq. This month, our troop presence will wind down to just around a few thousand. In winding down the war, the President honored the wishes of the American people. As we mark the end of the war, we honor the nearly 4,500 Americans who made the ultimate sacrifice in Iraq. Tens of thousands more have been wounded. We will never forget those who were lost in the war. We'll forever be grateful to them and to their families. I'm from Baltimore, Maryland. When my father was mayor, they built Baltimore Stadium. What would they call it? The consensus name was Baltimore Memorial Stadium, to honor those who had made so much sacrifice for our country. And General Pershing said, and that was engraved on Baltimore Memorial Stadium, "Time will not dim the glory of their deeds. Time will not indeed dim the glory of those who served and sacrificed in Iraq." I'm particularly proud to have presided over 4 years of a Congress that made more progress for our veterans and military families than has been made since the passage of the original GI Bill in 1944. But our work is not done. On the battlefield, our troops, on the battlefield, the military says we will leave no soldier behind. And when they come home, we promise, Democrats and Republicans working together, to leave no veteran behind. Over 1 million of our men and women in uniform served in Iraq. We must honor their service with economic opportunities and the benefits they deserve. We must remember that our commitment to our veterans is not while they serve or even for life. It is a commitment forever to them and their families. We must build a future worthy of their sacrifice. As the war in Iraq comes to an end, we express our enormous gratitude to those who have served, and because of them, we express our great optimism for the future. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia rise?
I rise to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of the Iran Threat Reduction Act offered by Chairman Ross Layton of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I thank the Chairman for her leadership on this issue. Mr. Speaker, there is no doubt that Iran poses a threat to our nation, our interests, and our allies. In the wake of the International Atomic Energy Agency report, it is clear that the United States must take swift action to proactively enforce policies that will not only deter but completely disengage the Iranian regime from its hostile nuclear proliferation program. This legislation will take steps to adequately address Iranian nuclear proliferation by taking aim at its primary source of funding, its energy sector, adding more rigorous financial and energy sanctions, including a provision that would allow judicial sanctions on those that conduct business in Iran's petroleum industry. As the Iranian nuclear threats continue to evolve, so should the United States' ability to address those threats. I urge my colleagues to support this important legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Rhode Island rise?
Unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman from Rhode Island is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, millions of hardworking Americans have lost their jobs through this economic crisis through no fault of their own. But rather than standing up and helping struggling Americans, yesterday this chamber advanced a bill doomed to fail because of all of the unrelated and controversial riders that were attached. According to the Rhode Island State Director of Labor, for every 2 part or full-time positions in Rhode Island, there are 7 applicants. There's an urgent need for Congress to extend federal emergency unemployment compensation in my state with a total of 58,000 unemployed Rhode Islanders. This social safety net provides a lifeline to struggling individuals, helping them to pay their mortgage and utilities, as well as put food on the table for their family. Families like Betsy Hamels in Jamestown, Rhode Island. Betsy supports her disabled husband and her severely disabled son, but doesn't know how she'll make ends meet while continuing to look for work if unemployment assistance is not extended. It's time to stop playing partisan games and stand up for the millions of Americans like Betsy and extend unemployment benefits now. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona rise? Without objection, gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, 1 year ago today, U.S. Border Patrol agent Brian Terry lost his life doing what he had done his entire life, serving his country. A native of Detroit, Brian Terry served with distinction in the U.S. Marine Corps and then as a police officer back home in Michigan. In 2007, Agent Terry was offered a job in the United States Border Patrol, a job he'd always dreamed of. Agent Terry lost his life during a shootout with armed thugs in Rio Rico, Arizona, just north of the Mexican border. Shortly after his death, his sister Michelle told the Associated Press, quote, "His dream all his life was to be a federal agent. It was always, I want to be a cop. I want to get the bad guys. It was his life. He said it was dangerous, but he loved what he did and wanted to make a difference." Mr. Speaker, we will never forget Agent Terry and the sacrifice he made. We will continue to keep his family in our thoughts and prayers. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from California rise?
For 1 minute.
Without objection, gentlelady from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, as we hear from members of this House every day, I thought it would be refreshing to bring the people's voice directly to this floor. So I asked my constituents to send me their thoughts that I could deliver as a 1-minute speech. And the following is from Susan Sigmund of San Diego, who sent me this on the Affordable Care Act to be reviewed by the Supreme Court. And she offered, "Being given the opportunity to speak before you, I wanted to make these 60 seconds witty, timely, and relevant to all. But having failed that," she wrote, "I'm just going to tell you my concern. It's the future of the health care law. The Supreme Court could strike it down next year. I have a pre-existing health condition," she wrote, "and I will die in about 3 years unless I'm able to buy a health insurance policy. I'm sure I am one of many facing this bleak possibility. As I understand it," she wrote, "if the mandate section requiring a policy goes, so goes the provision barring pre-existing condition discrimination. So if the time comes, please do the honorable thing and vote to allow your constituents with pre-existing conditions to buy health care insurance. Lives depend on it," she wrote. Thank you. So, Mr. Speaker, I just want to thank Susan Sigmund for bringing to the House her thoughts on health care. Thank you.
The gentlelady's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota rise? Without objection, gentleman from Minnesota is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday, members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus introduced an important bill, and it's called the Rebuild the American Dream for the 99% Act. This bill, this important Rebuild the American Dream for the 99% Act, would create 5 million jobs, Mr. Speaker, over 2 years, and cut the deficit by $2 trillion over 10 years. The Rebuild the American Dream for the 99% Act creates direct hire programs to put Americans back to work, provides grants for on-the-job training and employment services, invests $50 billion in infrastructure projects, creates a national infrastructure bank, improves Buy America provisions, ends the practice of foreign currency manipulation, protects wounded veterans from job discrimination, extends unemployment insurance, including for people at 99 weeks, supports the TANF Emergency Contingency Fund to help states pay for the cost of hiring unemployed workers. We can do these things. The Rebuild the American Dream Act, the 99% Act, does it. Thank you very much.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Texas rise? Without objection, gentlelady from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, in the calamity of news reports proliferating across America regarding the epidemic proportions of child sexual abuse, I introduce zero tolerance for child sexual abuse, H.R. 3650. I ask my colleagues to join me for a national statement of abhorring and standing against the abuse of our children. For a much more happier topic, I thank our leader for her comments on our returning troops. And I look forward to introducing H-Res, a resolution thanking and congratulating our returning troops, and as well having a day or 2 days of which our members will join me in wearing a yellow ribbon and as well commemorating the return of our wonderful troops and thanking their families from wherever they have come for this holiday season. What greater gift than the men and women who have served on the front lines to honor us by their presence here on the holiday season. Our message should be no silent state, no silent neighborhood, no silent community in reference to honoring them as they come home. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Illinois rise? Without objection, the gentlelady from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute.
Why did I vote against H.R. 3630 yesterday? I could list many reasons, but I only have 1 minute, so here's 3. 1, the bill extends unemployment insurance for some jobless Americans and then drastically cuts months off of benefits for others and makes all unemployed jump through demeaning hoops in order to get any benefits. 2, in order to reluctantly give the middle class a payroll tax break, it asks seniors and people with disabilities to pay more for Medicare, but refuses to ask millionaires and billionaires to pay 1 more cent. And 3, the bill threatens public health by preventing the Environmental Protection Agency from regulating dangerous mercury and other emissions, and then it goes a step further by threatening the public health by cutting the Prevention and Public Health Fund. H.R. 3630 is a political statement, not a serious proposal. And what a statement to make. More support for dirty air and water, increased health care costs for middle-income people, and less help for those struggling to find jobs. And I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia rise? The gentleman from California is recognized. For what purpose does the gentleman from California rise? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to pay tribute to No Veteran Dies Alone program at the Veterans Hospital in Fresno, California. During the holiday season, it's appropriate to give thanks. Members of the military follow the sacred oath of leave no man behind. The No Veteran Dies Alone program follows the ethos that ensures that every veteran knows that they are not forgotten in their remaining days. Men and women, some of who work at the hospital, volunteer their time to care for those who wore the uniform of the United States military. This innovative volunteer program helps our veterans' hospice patients spend their final days in friendship and warmth. During the holiday season, may we seek to lead lives as compassionate as the No Veteran Dies Alone program and the volunteers who selflessly serve our veterans. I yield the balance of my time.
And then yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Washington rise? Without objection, gentlelady from Washington is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to urge support of the Primary Care Workforce Access Improvement Act. This bipartisan bill, which I've introduced with my colleague Mr. Thompson from California, will ensure that some of the most rural parts of our country will have greater access to doctors, and that the high quality of health care that we value as Americans will continue. Right now, some areas of Washington State don't have enough doctors because there isn't enough funding for their residencies. Other areas, like Garfield County, simply have no doctors at all. As co-chair of the Congressional Rural Health Caucus, I can tell you this legislation directly helps by bringing more physicians to places like Eastern Washington by providing creative avenues for funding our graduate medical education. It also helps solve the longer-term problem of too few doctors in rural areas, because studies show that when someone does their residency in the rural areas, they're more likely to practice in the rural areas. I urge support of this legislation, and I thank Mr. Thompson for joining me with introducing it, and with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia rise?
Address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in reluctant opposition to the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012, which we'll be voting on today. The bill does include provisions that are vital to our national defense, but it also includes provisions that present a false choice between our safety and our values. Section 1021 would authorize the indefinite military detention of all terrorism suspects, allowing the United States to detain an individual, some of whom may be innocent, without charge or trial during this endless war on terrorism, undermines our most defining principles as a nation of individual freedom and justice for all. Mr. Chairman, our civilian law enforcement agencies have proven themselves capable of apprehending, interrogating, and prosecuting terrorism suspects. In fact, civilian courts have overseen the successful prosecution of more than 400 terrorists. The military courts, only 6. This Congress should not impose these law enforcement duties upon our troops. It is un-American and unconstitutional. We should reject the false choice between our short-term security and our long-term survival as the leader of the free world. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Vermont rise? Without objection, the gentleman from Vermont is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of the Iran Threat Reduction Act. Mr. Speaker, I believe in dialogue, and I very much believe in diplomacy. But despite an unprecedented effort by President Obama in his speech to the Iranian people for outreach, the Iranian government was unreciprocal in any kind of response. And instead, what we've seen is that they are pursuing the development of nuclear weapons full speed ahead. Last month, the International Atomic Energy Administration further confirmed Iran's nuclear aspirations with a report detailing efforts by the Iranian government to acquire the skills needed to weaponize highly enriched uranium. This is extremely dangerous. Iran has a long-standing relationship with Hezbollah, which continues to condone violence as a political tactic. And Iran is continuing to be the major bulwark of support for the brutal crackdown by the Syrian government on the democratic aspirations of its people. I urge my colleagues to support the Iran Reduction Act. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. What purpose does the gentleman from Utah rise?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. By direction of the Committee on Rules, I call up House Resolution 493 and asks for its immediate consideration.
Clerk will report the resolution.
House Calendar Number 100, House Resolution 493, resolved that upon adoption of this resolution, it shall be in order to consider the conference report to accompany the bill, H.R. 1540, to authorize appropriations for fiscal year 2012 for military activities of the Department of Defense, for military construction, and for defense activities of the Department of Energy, to prescribe military personnel strengths for such fiscal year, and for other purposes. All points of order against the conference report and against its consideration are waived. The conference report shall be considered as read. The previous question shall be considered as ordered on the conference report to its adoption without intervening motion except 1 hour of debate, and 2, 1 motion to recommit if applicable. Section 2, it shall be in order at any time through the remainder of the first session of the 112th Congress for the Speaker to entertain motions that the House suspend the rules as though under Clause 1C of Rule 15, if the text of the measure proposed in a motion is made available to members, delegates, and the resident commissioner, including pursuant to Clause 3 of Rule 29 on the calendar day before consideration. Section 3, on any legislative day of the first session of the 112th Congress after December 16, 2011, A, the journal of the proceedings of the previous day shall be considered as approved. B, the chair may at any time declare the House adjourned to meet at a time at a date and time within the limits of Clause 4, Section 5, Article 1 of the Constitution, to be announced by the Chair in declaring the adjournment, and C, bills and resolutions introduced during the period addressed by this section shall be numbered, listed in the congressional record, and when printed shall bear the date of introduction and may be referred by the Speaker at a later time. Section 4, on any legislative day of the second session of the 112th Congress before January 17, 2012, A, the Speaker may dispense with organizational and legislative business. B, the journal of the proceedings of the previous day shall be considered as approved if applicable. And C, the Chair at any time may declare the House adjourned to meet at a date and time within the limits of Clause 4, Section 5, Article 1 of the Constitution, to be announced by the Chair in declaring the adjournment. Section 5, the Speaker may appoint members to perform the duties of the Chair for the duration of the period addressed by Sections 3 and 4, as though under Clause 8A of Rule 1.
The gentleman from Utah is recognized for 1 hour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For the purposes of debate only, I yield the customary 30 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings, pending which I yield myself such time as I may consume. During the consideration of this resolution, all time yielded is for the purpose of debate only, and I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days during which they may revise and extend their remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, this resolution provides a standard conference rule report and other end-of-the-year housekeeping provisions. H.R. 1540, the National Defense Authorization Act for 2012, has been considered in committee. It was debated on the House floor. It included 152 amendments made in order before passing this chamber, and that was done in May with an overwhelming and bipartisan majority. Went to the Senate, and now we bring to you today a bipartisan conference report. I have to commend the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, the gentleman from California, Mr. McKean, as well as the ranking member, the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Smith, for truly continuing the tradition of bipartisanship and mutual cooperation in the Armed Services Committee and in this particular bill. There are some times when Congress has a reputation of being somewhat contentious and partisan, sometimes deservingly so. However, I have been a member of the Armed Services Committee myself for several years, and I recognize that they clearly understand Article 1 of the Constitution that requires a common defense of our country, and that in that particular committee, partisanship really has been checked at the door regarding the product of the Armed Services Committee, which is this annual Defense Authorization Bill. In essence, I think the process has been good, the efforts have been good, and it has made a significant issue that we are bringing here to the floor ready to pass in its final version from the conference committee. There are significant underlying issues that I think we will talk about during the course of the discussion on the rule and perhaps as the bill as well, but those things I think will be handled as they appear at this particular time. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I am going to reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Utah reserves. Gentleman, Mr. Hastings is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend from Utah for yielding the time. Mr. Speaker, it's been more than 10 years since the attacks of September the 11th. We fought 2 wars and have engaged in military action in numerous other countries. Hundreds of thousands of people have died, and many more have been wounded. We've spent more than $1 trillion. Osama bin Laden is dead. The Obama administration officials have declared that al-Qaeda is operationally ineffective. Here at home, we've reformed our national government, compromised our civil liberties, spent billions on a surveillance state, and created a culture of paranoia in which, even in the last few days, a reality TV show about Muslim Americans is subjected to a campaign of hate and intolerance. Before proceeding, let me commend the chairman and the ranking member of the relevant committee of jurisdiction that put this package together. I'm fundamentally opposed to many aspects of it, but I'm in tremendous agreement with their bipartisan efforts and the staffs of both of them and the other committee members for putting forth the effort to bring us to this point of discussion. We should take this opportunity at this moment in our history to seriously and carefully deliberate our nation's counterterrorism efforts. We ought to consider which policies are effective and which in the end only create more anti-American sentiment. We ought to consider which policies align with our national values and which instead undermine them. We ought to consider whether we should continue using the full thrust of the United States Armed Forces in country after country, or whether a more nuanced approach might better serve our needs. Unfortunately, the legislation before us does not attempt to answer these questions. Instead, it commits us to dive even further down the road of fear. It commits us to more war and more wasteful spending. And it commits us to ceding our freedoms and liberties on the mere suspicion of wrongdoing. This legislation erodes our society and our national security by militarizing our justice system and empowering the President to detain anyone in the United States, including American citizens, without charge or trial, without due process. If this is going to continue to be the direction of our country, Mr. Speaker, we don't need a Democratic Party or a Republican Party or Occupy Wall Street Party or Tea Party. We need a Mayflower Party. If we are going to undermine the foundational principles of this great country, then we might as well sail away to someplace else. This legislation establishes an authority for open-ended war anywhere in the world and against anyone. It commits us to seeing a terrorist in anyone who ever criticizes the United States in any country, including this one. The lack of definitions as to what constitutes substantial support and associated forces of al-Qaeda and the Taliban mean that anyone could be accused of terrorism. Congress has not tried to curtail civil liberties like this since the McCarthy era. But here we are today trying to return to an era of arbitrary justice, witch hunts, and fear-mongering. While this measure includes an exemption for United States citizens, it does not protect them from indefinite detention. In one fell swoop, we're setting up a situation where American citizens could have their 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th Amendment rights violated on mere suspicions. And by placing suspected terrorists solely in the hands of the military, these provisions deny civilian law enforcement the ability to conduct effective counterterrorism efforts. The fact of the matter is that our law enforcement agencies and civilian courts have proven over and over again that they are more than capable of handling counterterrorism cases. I had the distinct privilege in this country of serving as a federal judge and shepherding cases and protecting the interests of the United States, a vital security interest during that period of time. And in every one of those cases, some 11 over the period of 9 3/4 years, all of the defendants were found guilty. That is before now 2001. More than 400 suspected terrorists have already been tried in the federal courts of the United States of America. We should not break something that already works. The idea that the executive branch's current powers are inadequate to fight terrorism is proven false by 10 years of successful counterterrorism efforts.
The idea that the president, any president, needs a whole new expansion of his, and I hope one day soon her, powers is just wrong. Most national security experts, Democrats and Republicans, are telling us not to adopt this language. Many officials responsible for our homeland security are telling us not to adopt this language. A lot of our military leaders are telling us not to adopt this language, Mr. Speaker. This legislation goes too far. We spend billions of dollars every year on counterterrorism, but we weaken those efforts by tossing aside our own system of justice. We tell the American public that we are fighting overseas in order to protect our freedoms, but then we pass legislation that undermines those very same freedoms here in the people's house and at home. And we tell the rest of the world to emulate our democratic traditions and our rule of law, but we disregard those values in a mad rush to find out how we can pretend to be the toughest on terrorism. We won't defeat terrorism by using the military to lock up innocent people for the rest of their lives on the mere suspicion of wrongdoing. We will not defeat terrorism by claiming the entire world as a battlefield, and we will not defeat terrorism by replacing our rule of law with reckless, uncontrolled, and unaccountable powers. Mr. Speaker, we need to have a more considered debate about the best way to conduct our defense and counterterrorism policies. This bill contains over $600 billion in spending, runs to over 1,000 pages, and is coming to the floor less than 48 hours after it was filed. While the detainee provisions in this legislation might have received the most attention the last few days, there are plenty of other critical provisions that members may have opinions about, and that's why on these kinds of measures we should have open rules. I realize that I've said that Congress, and we are proving it at the end of this session, has a bad case of deadline-itis. But my friends in the Republican majority don't only have deadline-itis, they have deadline-ophilia. Yesterday, we considered a poorly conceived extenders package that will harm the middle class and weaken our economy. Today, we are considering controversial language in a defense bill that sets a dangerous precedent and will potentially harm civil liberties of American citizens. I appreciate that the Republican majority, many of whom are my friends, don't want their holiday season ruined by having to work. But that doesn't mean we have to ruin everyone else's holiday season by passing bad laws. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Florida reserves. Gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The issues and accusations that were brought up by the gentleman from Florida will be something we will address in the course of this debate, but I wish to do this in somewhat of a regular order. There are other issues, as he said, that are significant. And to address the first of those, I would like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Quayle.
Gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the rule and the conference report of the National Defense Authorization Act. The NDAA includes a long-term reauthorization of the Small Business Innovation Research and Small Business Technology Transfer programs. I was proud to serve as a conferee for this important bill. SBIR was originally signed into law by President Reagan and has been an effective tool supporting innovation among our small business community for nearly 30 years. Since its inception, this competitive grant program has enabled more than 100,000 research and development projects across the nation and has helped spawn familiar companies such as Qualcomm, Sonicare, and Symantec. Although this reauthorization of these programs isn't perfect, it improves them in a number of ways. It opens up the program for more small companies to participate. It increases the emphasis on commercialization of new technologies. Finally, it significantly strengthens the data collection and oversight requirements of the programs. In my hometown of Phoenix, we have a thriving tech community. By passing today's bill and providing long-term reauthorization, we will provide our small businesses the certainty they need to continue to innovate and grow and create jobs. I would like to thank Chairman Hall and Chairman Graves for all their work in ushering through this agreement, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Utah reserves. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased at this time to yield to my good friend, the distinguished gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lee, 2 minutes.
The gentlelady from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, let me thank the gentleman from Florida for yielding. He's a former member of the Intelligence Committee, and I just have to thank him for his tremendous leadership and for his opening statement, which laid out many of the concerns that many of us have about this bill. I rise today in strong opposition to this very controversial bill that directly attacks the bedrock values of America. I'm talking about the constitutional guarantees of due process for those charged with crimes. Now, against the wishes of President Obama, our Defense Secretary, Mr. Panetta, the Director of National Intelligence, Mr. Clapper, and FBI Director, Mr. Mueller, this bill allows the federal government to seize suspected terrorists, including United States citizens, and hold them in indefinite detention. Now, arresting citizens and holding them without trial violates the Fifth Amendment's due process guarantees. This bill fundamentally is un-American, and it threatens all of our liberties. We cannot allow those who seek to terrorize the American people to win by trashing the very civil liberties at the heart of our national identity. Giving up American ideals will not make us safer. This legislation undermines our national security and our democracy. Mr. Speaker, I would like to enter into the record this letter from 26 retired generals and admirals concerned about how the United States treats detainees.
Without objection.
Thank you. These veteran national security experts wrote this rare public letter denouncing the detention provisions. I will conclude with the words of those honorable retired generals and flag officers who warned that this legislation, and I quote, both reduces the options available to our commander-in-chief to incapacitate terrorists and violates the rule of law and would seriously undermine the safety of the American people. I ask my colleagues to defend the civil freedoms which we all cherish, to support our national security, to support our democracy, and to vote no on this very dangerous bill and this rule.
Gentlelady's time's expired. The gentleman from Florida reserve, gentleman from Utah is recognized.
I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes. Well, I'm happy. I will yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California for his view on this particular bill, Mr. McClintock.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for generously yielding to me to offer a dissenting view on Section 1021 of the underlying conference report. This is the section referenced by the gentleman from Florida that specifically affirms that the President has the authority to deny due process to any American the government charges with, quote, substantially supporting al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or any associated forces, whatever that means. Would substantial support of an associated force mean linking a website to a website that links to an al-Qaeda site? We don't know. The question before us is, do we really want to find out? We're told not to worry. The bill explicitly states that nothing in it shall alter existing law. But wait, there is no existing law that gives the President the power to ignore the Bill of Rights and detain Americans without due process. There is only an assertion by the last two presidents that this power is inherent in an open-ended and ill-defined war on terrorism. But it is a power not granted by any act of Congress until now. What this bill says is, what presidents have only asserted, Congress now affirms in statute. Well, we're told this merely pushes the question to the Supreme Court to decide if indefinite detainment is compatible with any remaining vestige of our Bill of Rights. Well, that's a good point if the court were the sole guardian of the Constitution. But it is not. If it were, there'd be no reason to require every member of Congress to swear to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. We are also its guardians. And today we, who have sworn fealty to that Constitution, sit to consider a bill that affirms a power contained in no law and that has the full potential to crack the very foundation of American liberty. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield to my good friend from New Jersey, Mr. Pascal, 2 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
3 minutes. 3 minutes, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, over 8 years since the start of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we are still not properly addressing traumatic brain injury, also known as the signature injury of both wars. I want to thank Chairman McKean, Ranking Member Smith, all the chairmen of the subcommittees, as well as members of this committee, are moving forward on this issue. I wish we had the same compromise as we do in other issues, as we would have it in other issues. I commend them for compromising. That's what our forefathers talked about. I'm glad to see that the Defense Centers of Excellence for Psychological Help in Brain Injury will move oversight to the Army, where there will be an increased efficiency and attention for our soldiers. But there are still problems with screening and treating our troops. Recently, an NPR ran an expose on how the Department of Defense has tested over 500,000 soldiers with a pre-deployment cognitive test, but has performed fewer than 3,000 tests post-deployment to actually compare the results and see if our troops were injured in theater. The fiscal 2008 National Defense Authorization Bill, bipartisanly supported, Public Law 110-181, required pre-deployment and post-deployment screenings of a soldier's cognitive ability. Currently, policy is clearly violating the intent of the law. We must ensure that the same tool is used for pre- and post-deployment cognitive screenings. We can't gauge the cognitive health of our troops without comparing tests. Last year, my amendment to the NDAA for fiscal year 2011 to address this passed the House, but is not in the final bill. We need to correct in the next year's defense authorization before any more soldiers slip through the cracks. It has consequences within service, and when they get out of service, it has bigger consequences. The Defense Department has raised concern with the currently administered test, but has stated it will not be able to select an alternative until 2015. That is not acceptable. The longer we wait, the longer our troops suffering from undiagnosed TBIs go untreated. I am concerned that we are not providing proper oversight for those soldiers who could have been injured in theater before this policy took effect in 2010. Many of these soldiers remain on active duty. We must ensure that they are tested and treated. I fear we are doing a disservice to them and our armed forces by not addressing this problem in this bill, and I ask everyone to consider this. This is a critical issue given little attention except by Mr. McKean and Mr. Smith. I ask that you do review that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman's time has expired.